From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, October 18th. Central Oregon has gotten a lot of attention this year because it could be pivotal to the state's tightest congressional race. But there is far more happening east of the Cascades than just the battle between Lori Chavez de Remer and Janelle Bynum. The folks in OPB's Bend Bureau have been digging into a bevy of interesting political contests this year. They've even been sued because of it. And on today's show, we're going to give you a rundown. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
Hi, I'm Catherine Steyer-Martinez. I'm a reporter-producer covering Bend and Central Oregon.
And I'm OPB Central Oregon Bureau Chief Emily Curitin-Cook.
It is a real pleasure to have you both on today. Especially want to welcome Catherine for her first appearance on OPB Politics Now. Let's start off today with what is probably the most dramatic race that you two have been looking into this year. Emily, there is a lot going on in this contest for Deschutes County Sheriff, including, as I mentioned, a lawsuit briefly filed against OPB. But let's just start with who the candidates are.
Yeah. It's a wild ride, but it starts with two men who've been colleagues at the sheriff's office for decades, and they're competing now to be the big boss. William Bailey is a captain of the patrol division, and Kent Vanderkamp is a sergeant heading up the county's drug enforcement team. I asked both of these candidates what the sheriff's office is supposed to do, and honestly, they sound a lot alike. They both want to address homelessness issues, enforce drug laws, and provide peace and security for the community. But these men's campaigns have unleashed so many accusations about lying and cheating. Bailey says he, for one, didn't expect the politics of this race to get this dirty.
All we can seem to talk about is the past. And not only the past, lies. And I can't defend against lies.
But not all of the mudslinging in this campaign is lies. Vanderkamp argues there's a retaliatory playbook that's at work here, one that was created by the departing sheriff Shane Nelson. Here's Vanderkamp.
Because this is just history repeating itself. This is a character assassination that he does every single time there's an election.
You mean Shane Nelson?
Yes.
So to understand the tone here, you have to understand the track record of Nelson, this departing sheriff. Over the last decade, he's been accused many times of bullying and retaliation against his own staff. And now that he's stepping aside, the sheriff is backing Bailey. That's as the employees union has endorsed Vanderkamp. And amidst all of those politics, Nelson launched an internal investigation about Vanderkamp that turned out to be quite an October surprise, Dirk.
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of the nexus here, or one of the things that really drew my attention, at least. This race has this level of intrigue because of these personnel complaints, I should say, from California. Just walk us through, how did the existence of all this come to light? It feels a little murky, but I know you've been tracking it.
I have, and I'm going to do you a favor and give you the abridged version, because there are a lot of twists and turns and players and different agendas at work in the sheriff's office. But what you really need to know is that Nelson, the sitting sheriff, led the charge to investigate Vanderkamp after he got an external complaint. And that complaint detailed a lot of troubling allegations between Vanderkamp and a woman who used to run a nonprofit that he's a board member of. But shoehorned in this long complaint is a grievance that there's a chance Vanderkamp's law enforcement career began before Oregon, which is not something he's disclosed before. So it turns out he did leave something off of his job application when he first applied to work in Oregon more than 20 years ago. In the mid-1990s, Vanderkamp served as a reserve police officer in La Mesa, California. And city officials there told me his employment ended in 1997. Nelson, for his part, suspects that Vanderkamp was fired. But La Mesa wouldn't initially fork over the receipts to answer this question. So Nelson actually got Deschutes County to sue this California city and get it to back down, fork over the records. And while Nelson wouldn't talk to me about all of this in an interview off the cuff, I did get him to read a statement about his own view of his motivations to do this.
This is not election interference. Our office is fulfilling its legal obligations and duty to investigate complaints.
So that duty, as he calls it, culminated in Deschutes County getting La Mesa to turn over 100 pages of personnel records about Vanderkamp, and those detail an internal investigation when he was a reserve officer decades ago now. This stint in California is something he did not mention when he was hired in Oregon. And if it turns out he was fired from La Mesa and didn't disclose it to Oregon, that could actually be a pretty big deal for Vanderkamp's credibility and potentially his certification as a law enforcement officer.
You were keenly, obviously, trying to get a hold of these 100 pages or so of records that came up from La Mesa. It wasn't easy to figure out what they said, right? Lay out for listeners, though, this very interesting chain of events for how you ultimately got your hands on what these things say.
Yeah, here it's another odyssey, believe it or not. It started with something pretty simple, actually, though, that I do a lot, pretty much every week, if not more often. I filed a public records request to a public agency for information that is in the public interest. And in this case, Deschutes County was the agency I went to. I knew that the sheriff's office had gone to great trouble and public expense to get the La Mesa records from California. So I argued Oregon officials should hand them over to me since Vanderkamp is a political candidate and the voters deserve to be able to vet him. The county at first basically told me to pack sand. They were like, no. And then they did back down in the face of arguments about the public interest here. And here's where things started to get really interesting. When officials let Vanderkamp know that they were about to hand over the personnel records from La Mesa, he responded. He sued OPB, the county, and me to try and block the release. His attorneys even briefly got a temporary restraining order to keep the information protected. Yeah, it just gets wilder, Dirk. But that lawsuit didn't have a lot of steam. It became a moot point pretty much as soon as it began. That's because Vanderkamp's own attorneys, they're with the firm Employment Law Professionals Northwest, they accidentally released the records first. An attorney with the firm, I almost feel bad for the guy, he inadvertently posted links to them in public court filings. So when a judge finally did hear this case, he was immediately like, yeah, no, this is moot. And then he actually ordered Vanderkamp to post the records on his own campaign website.
Well, and not surprisingly, Emily, you have been very involved in this. You noticed that these records had been posted and provided to the court. And you also reported on what they showed. What did we learn from these records from La Mesa, California?
The records detail why police officials in La Mesa, in fact, wanted to dismiss Vanderkamp for what they called serious incidents of misconduct. La Mesa investigated 5 separate incidents where his fellow officers made various allegations against Vanderkamp. Investigators actually sustained one of those claims, and they found he had violated standards of conduct around honesty. What began as sort of just a dressing down for using a radar gun without proper training became an investigation into Vanderkamp's truthfulness. Investigators wrote that when they confronted him, Vanderkamp claimed, oh no, I am certified to use radar. But La Mesa could not find any record of this. They went to great lengths to track down and verify what he had said. And in the end, they decided Vanderkamp was intentionally misleading them. Officials decided, and I'll just use their words here because this is all, as we noted, been a bit litigious. Officials decided, quote, Vanderkamp's actions represent serious incidents of misconduct which bear directly on his credibility, end quote. But again, it's not clear if Vanderkamp was actually fired. He says he wasn't.
They never actually terminated me, and they never actually served me with anything, which is why there's been confusion over what this has been about because I didn't have any knowledge about it.
I asked him about a letter in those records that La Mesa sent to him, setting a date for an interview when he was supposed to come in and show up and talk about the allegations against him.
Did you show up for that interview?
I don't recall an interview.
In a previous interview with OPB, Vanderkamp told me he also didn't remember if he left La Mesa on his own or if the city told him not to come back for any more shifts. When we talked again about this after the documents actually came out, he said, oh no, now I'm certain that I left voluntarily.
Yeah, and as you point out, right, I mean, part of this has bearing because if he was fired and it didn't disclose that when he became a law enforcement officer in Oregon, like that is an issue. But obviously, you know, the content of these complaints raises questions about why someone's using a radar and then lying about being certified and all that. So pertinent in that regard, almost regardless of whether or not he was fired. But you noted something earlier, Emily, and I just want to make sure we touch on it. You know, Vanderkamp isn't the only person who has faced allegations of his past. Deschutes County for a while has had a sheriff with some who has experienced controversy, right? Nelson hasn't always been popular.
Yeah, he hasn't been popular with a lot of people, and he's also cost the county a lot of money defending him from lawsuits brought by his own employees. And yeah, Vanderkamp has definitely pointed to, he told me, this lawsuit, it wasn't personal. It wasn't even about OPB at all. It was actually just trying to put a stop to, his words were the BS games and shenanigans of Shane Nelson. So he is pointing to this history. And in many ways, this election for an open seat has been playing out like a referendum on Nelson, the retiring sheriff, with Bailey sort of acting as a placeholder or as an equivalent to Nelson. Bailey's not only been endorsed by the sheriff, he's been promoted by the sheriff pretty dramatically in recent years. So that ties him to this administration as it's come under a lot of scrutiny, not just for lawsuits alleging violations of employment law, but also for overspending, stuff like buying the office golf carts or a slushy machine despite budget shortfalls. Bailey, for his part, says he's his own man, but he also defends Nelson's legacy.
Look, every police agency has personnel challenges. Every police and law enforcement agency has lawsuits. Every police agency has challenges when it comes to addressing behavioral issues and having to hold people accountable.
An officer who ran against Nelson directly in 2016 was later fired after being the subject of internal investigations. In 2021, a jury awarded him $1 million for being unlawfully fired by Nelson, and that bill went to Deschutes County. I called up a sheriff expert to chat about just how unusual is all this drama. Jessica Pishko is a lawyer and journalist who just put out a book called The Highest Law in the Land, and it looks at why sheriffs across the country so often lack accountability.
There's consistent problems of poor hiring, poor training, bad communication with the community, misuse of resources. There's retaliatory hiring and firing or failure to promote women. All of these are really common in sheriff's offices.
So she says the cost of internal disarray often gets paid by the public, and not just through lawsuits or overspending. This year, actually, a CBS News investigation found widespread and chronic abuses in sheriff's offices nationwide and systemic failures that are perpetuating this.
This is clearly a fascinating one that I'm grateful that you are watching and will be watching up until November 5th. It is not, however, the only race going on in Deschutes County and Central Oregon. Catherine, you have been going deep on Bend City Council races this year. For folks who might not know intimately sort of the makeup of Bend City government, what's the makeup of the city council there?
So there are 6 city councilors and a mayor. All the seats are nonpartisan. A lot of people I spoke with for this story told me Bend City Council used to be Republican controlled. Now, even though they're all nonpartisan seats, every city council member and the mayor, they're all affiliated with the local Democratic Party in some way.
Right. This is a trend we've seen around Bend in recent decades. What once was a conservative area reliably with the growth of that area has become far more liberal. And, again, as you point out, it is a nonpartisan city council, but the fact that it is dominated by Democrats and that Democrats sort of control the city in some ways has led to some really interesting dynamics in Bend, right? These are races, like I say, they're not partisan. There are no party primaries. But you reported that the battle for the Democratic Party's endorsement there in Deschutes County in many ways is sort of acting like a partisan primary. What did you find out? How does this work?
Deschutes Dems started endorsing Bend City Council candidates in 2018, according to party officials. And then there's this document that people who want the endorsement from the Democratic Party, they sign it. And it kind of lists out things that they will and won't do if they get the endorsement. Multiple people I spoke with told me that it's kind of understood that when someone seeks and doesn't get the Democratic endorsement from Deschutes Dems, they drop out, partly because of this document that they've signed.
Right. So I want to run for city council. I'm going to put my hat in the ring, but if the Deschutes Dems say no, we like someone else, I'm effectively just gonna abandon my race, and people feel like that is the expectation of them just by virtue of seeking this endorsement. The party is really doing something parties do, I think, which they would say trying to make sure they hold a seat by avoiding splitting the vote between two Democratic candidates. So effectively, their two candidates aren't sharing votes, and then maybe a Republican or someone who identifies as conservative wins the race. Catherine, though, not everyone in the Democratic establishment there is happy with that arrangement, as you reported.
That's right. And before I move on, I should say that the Deschutes Democrats don't explicitly say you have to drop out. There's no one says you must drop out. It's just kind of an understood thing. I just want to make sure that's clear. Okay. But Barb Campbell, this year, she was not endorsed by the Deschutes Democrats, and she didn't drop out, Barb has been, I think she's been a counselor for 10 years now. So she was first elected in 2014. And, Barb has really benefited from the endorsement process during her time in office. But this year, she said she felt like it went off the rails, especially when she saw good qualified candidates drop out. And she felt like that was unfair to the voters, ultimately, in the city of Bend.
And so that has led to this kind of interesting dynamic, right, where longtime city councilor Barb Campbell is in the race. She's a Democrat. She doesn't have the party's endorsement. And in fact, the party, as you know, has endorsed another candidate in this Bend District 4 race, Steve Platt. I wonder, is that maybe going to have does that present the risk, at least, of this outcome that the Deschutes Democrats are trying to avoid, which is that two Democrats share the vote and someone else sneaks in and sort of wins the seat?
Well, it is a nonpartisan race. I can't really speculate on the outcome. The third person in the race, Chet Wamble, he is running for seat 4 and running against Platt and Campbell. He is endorsed by the Deschutes Republicans. It's interesting to note that Wamble told me that the Deschutes Republicans reached out to him to ask if they could endorse him. There wasn't any sort of it wasn't like he had to go to the Deschutes Republicans and be like, oh, will you endorse me? They just reached out to him. Right. But to be honest, I'm not really sure which way this race is going to go.
Yeah, totally. We never know until the ballots are counted, but it is an interesting dynamic for sure. So that's a bit about the politics of these council races. Catherine, you've also reported on the top issue that Bend voters are worried about as they're making these selections this year. And it's probably not all that big a surprise to people.
Yeah, it's housing. No shock there. So we sent out a questionnaire to Bend city councilors to ask them what their top concerns are, what they felt the top concerns were for voters. And, most everyone who responded said housing in some form or another. And that's pretty in line with what I hear in community groups, talking to people who live here just on the street. Everyone is talking about housing. And that's because it's really expensive to rent or own a home here. Past reporting shows that someone needs to make about $72,000 just to rent a one-bedroom apartment and not be cost burdened. And that's people are not making $72,000 here generally. Right. It's not really happening. A few candidates are talking about how they want to speed up the process to get homes and apartments built. So kind of cutting the red tape, speeding up permit processing. A handful of people are focusing on affordable housing. One candidate thinks the free market will solve the problem. And then a few others are concerned with helping people stay housed. So trying to address, ways to help people from becoming unhoused or homeless.
Yeah, and we know from polling that housing and homelessness is consistently the top issue that Oregonians are concerned about. Obviously, that is playing out here in Portland, but Bend has seen such struggles with this. So it will be really interesting to see sort of how the candidates navigate that going up to Election Day. I want to zoom out just a bit. Deschutes County has another interesting race, which is this ballot measure that's up for consideration. It would increase the number of county commissioners from the current 3 to 5. Catherine, who is proposing this and why do they argue it's a good idea?
So John Halen is a local political activist and business owner, and he got the initiative onto the ballot this year. People tried to do this in the past, increase the number of commissioners. And this year, it's going to be on the ballot for people to vote on. They'll be at-large seats, though. It's not as if they're going to be like 2 more people added, and they'll have like districts or anything like that. It's just straight up adding 2 more commissioners. So proponents, they're kind of hoping for better fiscal management. They want commissioners to be able to meet and talk about issues that they're dealing with outside of public meetings. Currently, they can't do that due to public meetings laws, just because there's only 3 commissioners. And so 2 would be a quorum, basically, and that can't happen outside of a public meeting. Also, some folks say it'll give Deschutes County residents better representation by virtue of having more people on the commission. So more people will be represented, right? They'll be able to access more commissioners, kind of.
And as you reported, not everyone is a fan of this idea. What are the arguments against this move?
Yeah, well, the main argument that I hear from people is the cost. That's kind of the big thing that people are saying. It'll be too expensive to add 2 more commissioners. And they're talking about like the cost of salary and, maybe creating space for 2 more commissioners in the county office. But people who are for adding 2 more people, they kind of point out, well, the commission in its current state has already cost the county millions of dollars. And so this can actually maybe bring better financial oversight and potentially save some money. So I'm not sure if that, how much you want to buy into that argument, but that's the back and forth of it.
Gotcha. My mind always goes to political considerations on stuff like this. Deschutes County Commission, like the Bend City Council, is nonpartisan. But I think it's also pretty well known that the commission is made up of 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat currently. Reading your story made me wonder if there was any hope that by expanding the commission by 2 seats, maybe there would be more liberal voices on the commission just by virtue of the growth in Deschutes County. Maybe that's part of the hope here, sort of rejiggering the political balance of the body. Is that anything that folks are arguing there?
It wasn't really something that I heard to the people I talked to, that they wanted more Democrats or more progressive or liberal voices on the commission. I think most people just wanted more thoughtfulness and a little bit more care brought to the business of running the county. I mean, it's certainly possible that, if this measure passes and then 2 more people come on, that they could be democratically aligned. Right. But yeah, it's anyone's guess.
Right. It just, obviously depends on quality of candidates and what all the other factors that go into political races. Okay. Lastly, I want to touch briefly on a couple of legislative seats out there that are some of the most closely watched in the state this year. One is, I think, in some people's eyes, maybe a foregone conclusion. That is the race to replace Senator Tim Knopp. He's a Republican who Politics Now listeners probably know cannot seek re-election because of the walkout he led in the legislature last year.
Yeah, with Tim Knopp stepping aside, that is a big change for Bend. He has wielded a lot of power and is, of course, a Republican. Now the candidates for his district, or for Senate District 27, are Democrat Anthony Broadman and Republican Michael Summers. Broadman is currently a Bend City Councilor, and Summers has served on the Redmond School Board.
So this is a district that, as we've talked about, has been growing more sort of democratically aligned or liberal as Bend grows. But the changes made in the 2021 redistricting process probably sealed the deal. At least a lot of Democrats think that the district really aligns with them pretty well and that they are poised to take it. As an example, President Biden won this district by almost 20 points in 2020. I just think Democrats feel pretty good about Broadman and are basically counting on this as a flip at this point. How does it feel on the ground there, Emily? What is the vibe like in Deschutes County?
I would say that's a fair temperature check right there. I mean, one way to look at it is the spending in this race is quite lopsided. And on the ground, I'm seeing that translate into which candidate's name is out there more in mailers, ads, and on yard signs here in Bend. Summers, the Republican, seems to be at a disadvantage in that regard. He's raised about $380,000 and spent the bulk of it. The Democratic candidate, the favorite, as I think we could fairly say, is Broadman, and he has a lot more cash to work with. He's raised about $730,000 and has another $200,000 still in his war chest.
And just to be fair, I was chatting with a Republican consultant yesterday. They are not willing to concede this. They really like Summers as a candidate. They think he's affable. He's a businessman in the region, has been for a while. So they are not willing to say that this is a throwaway. The other race out there, I think, though, is the more intriguing one, which is this contest between State Representative Emerson Levy, who is a Democrat, and Carrie Lopez, a Republican who sits on the Redmond School Board. This is a House district that is far more closely divided. It's in the running for most expensive state House race this year, actually, which is notable because, you don't need to spend as much to run in Bend as you do in Portland or the Willamette Valley in many places. But both parties have really zeroed in on this as a battleground. Levy also, though, has the backing of the state's largest business organization, OBI, Oregon Business and Industry. That's pretty interesting to me, honestly, because it's a dynamic we don't always see in these really hard-fought races. Obviously, often business interests are aligning with Republicans, but she's got the backing there. We also have former Congressman Greg Walden spending a boatload of money with his Bring Balance to Salem PAC to support Lopez. I mean, this is just going to be a very, very hard-fought race, and I think it could be one of those that ends up dictating the balance of the state house. We have covered a lot today, but since we don't always get to focus on Central Oregon on this podcast, I want to make sure we don't leave out anything really interesting that you all are keeping your eyes out for. Anything else you want to note that you're watching this year?
I am personally excited to see how the state legislature shapes up and if the Democrats can get that supermajority you're talking about. And then when they convene in January for their long session, how they're going to tackle issues of housing and development. Bend and Redmond are both really watching those legislative priorities, and the cities have already they've made quite a bit of noise about stuff already, considering we're still pretty far out from the session. Bend and Redmond say they're trying to balance water conservation in particular with the governor's housing mandates. And I think these elections will have a lot of influence on how those conversations play out in the state house.
Yeah, absolutely. If Democrats prevail in the races they're hoping, they will have super majorities in both chambers this year. And that tends to really be able to shift the tone of a legislative session. Okay, let's leave it there. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us from beautiful Bend today.
You're very welcome, Dirk.
You're welcome.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. But if you don't want to wait, check out all of OPB's election coverage at opb.org/elections. There you'll find stories, videos, and even comics explaining the biggest races of the year. While you're there, you can become an OPB member. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.